and no one agrees, right? Even within the mystical theologians, everybody accepts the Trinity, but what it means to them is often quite different, as Caitlin was saying, in practical terms. Anything else? Okay, we want to discuss, we were going to talk about meditation versus contemplation, but there's actually, I forgot there was a chapter later in the book on contemplation, so we'll just have that discussion later, when it's maybe the next unit or the one after. Okay, first we need to talk about the Desert Fathers. Now we've discussed these to some extent, and so this is just a quick summary of things that have popped up throughout the discussions at various times. We've talked about asceticism and hermeticism. Hermit means being alone. And the fundamental idea here is that you have to withdraw. Let's see if I can make this go down. You have to withdraw from the world at a social level. That is, you abandon the world, you abandon possessions, all these things. And that one way you can do that is going in the wilderness. Okay? The other thing is you have to withdraw from the world at an interior level. And this is related to the idea of stillness, quiet, silence, and so forth. It's called hesychasm in Greek, and we'll discuss this concept a little bit later. Okay, so the idea is that withdrawal in both social and spiritual way allows you to abandon all the things of the world, and therefore you're completely empty and can be filled with God's presence and so forth. Now, at a practical level, that meant guys went out in the wilderness and lived, and we talked about them being considered very holy, right? And that holiness is manifest by both wisdom and inspiration, by miracles, and by their social behavior. Now, some of these guys behaved in very strange ways, okay? But it was considered a model of holiness. Now, we've talked about Antony, who is the model for the hermetic, that is, being a hermit. And St. Pachomius, who we haven't discussed, I think, is the model for being a communal. That is, I mean, practically speaking, what happened was you'd have these holy men out in the wilderness. And there were others besides Antony. Antony's just the most famous because Athanasius wrote his biography. There's lots of different guys that are mentioned. And they are, out in the desert. There's not much water. There's not much food. And when they get disciples coming around them, it creates a problem of feeding and watering these guys. I mean, Christ had exactly that problem at the Sermon on the Mount, right? Or no, the feeding of the 5,000. All these people gather around, they want to hear the Master, and there's no food and water. Nobody's got a plan. So Christ miraculously provides that, but for the monks, they have to come up with some plan, and that is organizing and forming communities and assigning somebody to go get food from the village and all those types of things. So in practical terms, the hermetic life is not feasible. I mean, it is for a couple of guys, but not for hundreds of disciples. And so it creates a communal model. Now, how these communal models worked differed from group to group, but it starts with what are called the Desert Fathers. These are holy men and women, and mainly men, but some women as well, because remember, women can form part of monasticism in the Christian medieval Christian terms. Let me fit the width here so you can see it better. Okay, so you withdraw from the world and you focus entirely on your interior life, the life of the spirit. Chastity is part of this. That is, you can't withdraw from the world if you're filled with lust and sexual desire. Okay? There is repetitious prayer that we've talked about. There's also the idea of charity. Now, Christ says, sell all that you have and follow me. Right? This is one of his commandments to his disciples. And these guys took that absolutely literally. They would sell everything they had. Some of them didn't have anything, but if there were some really rich guys that gave away all their stuff to the poor and went off to be monks. And there was a strong element of study in this. This study amounted to sometimes reading scriptures, more often reading them aloud to groups, and frequently reciting and chanting scriptures. If you go to a Greek Orthodox Mass nowadays, the traditional ones in the Middle East, all of the whole liturgy is sung, and a great deal of that is singing the scriptures. Same thing with the Jewish cantors who read scriptures, that there's a way to sing it. The Quran is chanted in the same way. So all three religions use chanting of scriptures, not just saying them out loud, but having a rhythm, almost a music to it, as part of what's going on here. Now, this is an example of a saying of one of these guys. They're called the Fathers. This comes from Abba in Syriac Aramaic, which just means father, right? And the ladies are called, I think it's Amma, which means mother, okay? And so it's essentially an honorific title, meaning you're the, you're my father, master of discipleship. This gets turned into abbot in the West. So you see the heads of monasteries are called abbots. Now, this hermit, here's a saying. This is taken from a book called the Sayings of the Fathers, and this is sayings of these desert monks. Take care to be silent. Empty your mind. So this is this idea of complete abandoning. Don't be concerned about anything. Attend to your meditations in the fear of God, whether you are resting or at work. So you've got to think about God all the time. And if you do this, you will not fear the attacks of demons. What are the demonic attacks? In one sense, they're temptations. But in another sense, like if somebody would say, the demon of lust has attacked me. Okay? But in another sense, these are real ontological beings, like angels, only, they're evil beings who oppress the monks. Another characteristic of these desert fathers is miracles. Technical term is thaumaturgy. And this derives from the idea of the imitation of Christ. The mystic must imitate Christ in all things. That is, in his lifestyle, in his commandments, whatever. But that includes the ability and need to imitate Christ in his powers. That is, you can do miracles like Christ did. And there are several New Testament passages that reflect that. These signs shall follow them that believe. If you believe, you will have these signs. If you don't, you won't have the signs. And if you don't have the signs, that means you really don't believe. So therefore, these monks were believed to be able to do miracles just like Christ's miracles. There's lots of stories about visions and healing, raising dead, exorcism. Christ is an exorcist, right? He's casting out demons on a regular basis. And so the monks do this as well. And then speaking in tongues is sometimes said to be angelic prayer. You speak in the language of the angels. And other times they describe themselves as talking to animals. That is, they've learned the Edenic language, or the Adamic language, okay?
So wasn't Francis of Assisi famous for that?
Yeah, his relationship with animals reflects he has been restored to the pre-fall state. And so you see he has some nature poetry as well that reflects this stuff. Now, the rest of this stuff is just a bibliography. I've tried to collect the major primary sources on these guys. And the big one is Sayings of the Desert Fathers. Okay? I mean, it's just a big collection of these guys. And then all of this has been translated to English. And if you want to pursue this more, this book is a good introduction. It's a little old, but, it kind of gives the whole overview of this movement. Okay, any questions on that stuff? Now, as an exemplar of this, we talked about Simeon the Stylite. And he's just one of my favorite dudes, so we're going to talk about him a little bit more, largely because dang it, this thing doesn't work. I have some slides of him. So, he lives in the 5th century, he lives in Syria, and he was a monk, and he was Uber monk. He was a water walker monk. He did everything twice as bad or twice as hard as any other monk. And he got really annoying to the other monks. And they, if they'd fast for one day, he'd fast for 2. If they'd stay awake all night, he'd stay awake for a week. That type of stuff. And he would berate the other monks for not being ascetic enough. And so eventually they got mad at him and he went off and became a hermit. and was living out in the desert, but then people thought he was a holy guy, and they came and were annoying him, just saying, oh, teach us, you make me a miracle, whatever. They were annoying this guy. And so he climbed up on top of this pillar so he could be completely alone. Now, how he got up there, I have no idea. But at any rate, it was a giant pillar, and a piece of the pillar actually survives. I'll show you in a second. But here you can see he's seated on this pillar. There's always a rope going down. This is his basket that he hangs down to get the food and water. And here you can see all the people gathering around to learn from him because of his great holiness. This is the Byzantine emperor Leo, who came and asked him questions. I think it was about, I can't remember what the question was, but at any rate. Here's a couple other photos of icons of him. You can see on his pillar with the jars hanging down. That were his. This is his church. Now, in Syria today, near Aleppo, there's a church, which is the Church of Saint Simeon. They took the pillar that he was on when he died, and he actually never came down except once when he climbed down to go climb on a higher pillar, because the people were annoying him. He could hear them from the lower pillar, so he climbed on a bigger pillar. But they built this church, which is a cruciform church here, and in the center is this pillar. Now, all that's left is a piece of it because it fell over in an earthquake and got all busted up. But there was a big dome over this. You can see it's been destroyed. After the Arab conquest, it kind of fell into disuse. But here you can see all the pilgrims coming, and there's the pillar he was on, and he just lived on the top of that. He apparently tied himself down so he wouldn't roll off in his sleep, that type of thing. And I have not been able to find, despite extensive research, his toilet facility used, but who knows. This is the entrance to the church. This was a huge pilgrimage shrine. Okay, there's the pillar. There's what's left of it. It's just that knob of a rock that's sitting there. Okay, so Simeon of Stylites is an example of the Desert Father movement. All right, now he's really big in the West, in the East. Not so famous in the West, although he was known in the West. But Antony was famous in both places. Antony's the guy who became the prototype. And that's because Athanasius wrote that biography. We mentioned that, right? And it was an international bestseller. There's hundreds of copies that survive. And we know that Augustine read it. He talks about getting that biography, reading it, and he wanted to form a proto-monastic community, imitate Antony. So this is part of his, I think it's in the Confessions that he talks about this. It didn't work out real well, but I mean, he was highly inspired by this. Okay, so that's the Desert Fathers. Now, what's their impact on monasticism? What's the impact of Desert Fathers on monasticism?
Well, they were kind of the founders of it, right?
Right, founded monasticism, and then monasticism lays the foundation for mysticism. That is, the monastic life is where most people of a mystical bent went. And most mystics whom we've been reading are monks up through maybe the 14th century. Monks or nuns, right? Occasionally you'll find some that aren't, but the vast majority are. And often you'll find a lay person who has some type of visionary experience and then goes and becomes a monk to be a mystic. That is, they don't feel they can stay in the lay life and still be mystical. Now, all of this is going to change with the Protestant Reformation, which believes monasticism is a corruption of earliest Christianity. And so Protestant mystics are far more individualistic, but medieval mystics in both Greek and Latin cases tend to be monks. So a lot of these ideas of the fathers, miracle working, all that stuff gets brought into the mystical life because it's associated with monasticism. Okay? Questions on that? Okay, let's look at McGinn 6 and 7, which has been discussed already, but I want to add a couple things to what Caitlin said. Number one is, everybody knows what the Nicene Creed is? It was founded at the Council of Nicaea 325, which attempts to define the Trinity. The problem is, it was an attempt, its real function was to make a vague and ambiguous statement that could be accepted by all the different Trinitarian groups as that it was vague enough that everybody could follow it. And so it, required redefining and redefining it multiple times. But it remains since 325 has remained the fundamental statement of the nature of the Trinity for both Eastern and Western Christianity. So you need to understand that the Trinity is crucial to medieval mysticism. Now notice how that's very distinct from Judaism and Islam. Okay? And Christ is central to medieval mysticism, Christian mysticism, and that again is quite distinct from Judaism and Islam. So although all three monotheistic mysticisms share a lot of characteristics and basic ideas, there's lots and lots of differences in all sorts of details. No medieval mystic would say you can be mystical without Christ. Okay? Lots of neo-mystics say, yeah, it doesn't matter. You can be a Sufi mystic, you can be a Christian mystic. It's all leading to the same God. But no medieval guy would say that. Okay. It cannot be understood rationally. And therefore, it is a mystery, and the mystics can understand it through mystical knowledge. So in part, what's going on here is that mysticism is the way to understand the Trinity. Does that make sense? Now, you can make discursive statements about it, but that's to really understand it, you can only do it through mysticism. So, in other words, for the mystics, the key to understanding Christianity is mysticism. You can't understand it without it. Do you see why they would think that? Now, lots of theologians might disagree with them, but that's how they conceptualized it. Now, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Mechthild is German for Matilda, I think, but at any rate, it's also raises the issue of the rise of vernacular language. What does that mean?
Vernacular is just what is spoken.
Right, the spoken language. What was Latin in medieval times? It was an academic, scholarly, religious, liturgical language, but it was not spoken on a day-to-day basis by most people. Now, you have in Paris a place called the Latin Quarter, and that's where all the students lived that were going to the Paris University in the 13th, 14th century. And what that means is that you had Germans and Italians and English and Spaniards and so forth that lived in that quarter, and the only language they all shared was Latin. So they spoke Latin in the Latin Quarter because it was an international quarter for the students. Everywhere else in France, they spoke French, right? So the vernacular language is the rise of all mystical writings, or 99% of them or whatever, are in Latin up through the 13th century. When you begin to, really late 13th century, you begin then to see the rise of vernacular language. That is, they write in the daily language that they speak. Part of this derives from the fact that some of these people did not know Latin, but they had a mystical bent. And part of it is that there is the beginnings of preaching, popular preaching in the lay languages that contain mystical elements. The best example of that's Meister Eckhart in the 13th century, who mainly his mystical writings are his sermons that were given in German. Now, these medieval forms of French and German and Italian or so forth are sometimes quite different than our modern. It's kind of like the difference between Chaucer and modern English. But nonetheless, these are vernacular movements. And what that indicates is that, or what it permits then, is essentially the spread of monastical impulses to the lay people instead of just the clerical, educated elite. Do you see what I'm saying there? And this is going to be a characteristic of Renaissance and early modern mysticism, is that it's in the lay language and it moves away from its pure monastical origins. Now, you had a question?
Yeah, so when they were speaking Latin in the 13th century and so forth, was it so different from the ancient Latin by then that they had a hard time understanding?
Yes, it was pronounced different than ancient Latin. Right. For example, and the Latin used in the different regions was accented differently, so that an Englishman would speak Latin differently than an Italian. But they could figure that out. But yes, for example, in Julius Caesar is the way an American or an Englishman would have said Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is the way an Old Latin would have said it. But Old Latin had died out. And then, for example, the K and the C originally was a K sound, becomes a S sound in some forms of medieval Latin, remains a K sound in others, becomes a ch in others. Like in Latin, in Italian, it becomes Cesare, right? Cesare Borgia. So it's a ch sound. So there's a few letters that get mispronounced like that, and then the vowels will, the value of the vowels will vary as well. So there were already dialects of Latin in the Middle Ages. Now they all wrote it the same, but they would pronounce it differently. And that's true of English today, right? I mean, we do that, and they could figure it out. Okay, any other questions? So vernacular mysticism is an important concept there. We need to emphasize the centrality of Christophany. That is to say, the goal of the mystics was often to have a vision of Christ. Now, it could encompass a vision of Mary, and if you look at Dante, for example, when he ascends into paradise, first he meets Saint Bernard, the mystic. Saint Bernard introduces him to Mary, who introduces him to her son Jesus, who introduces him to the Trinity. So it's not like one precludes the other. But a Christophany is a key ingredient. Christophany means a manifestation of Christ. And frequently you could have a Christophany that included Mary seated on a throne holding the baby Jesus. I can't remember which one of our texts talks about that. That there is Mary is involved in this. Visions of the Father and the Holy Spirit are less common. Okay? But Christ has a human form, and therefore he is kind of the focus of this. Now, we talked about St. Francis. This is all based on the idea of being crucified with Christ, that Paul says in Galatians, I have been crucified with Christ. And then he also, another place, I forgot to write down the reference, says, I bear the marks of Christ upon me, Paul says. And that probably means, he's got, he was beaten, by like the Romans or whatever. He was beaten several times as punishment for his preaching. And so he says, I bear the marks of Christ, meaning I got beaten just like Christ got beaten. I mean, that's probably what Paul's talking about. But when Assisi reads this, or Francis reads this, he says, oh, marks of Christ, those are the wounds from the crucifixion, not something else. So stigmata means the marks, okay? That's literally what it means in Greek. And what it comes to mean for Thomas is he actually physically is, suffers the wounds of Christ with him. And he does this through a vision of a seraph, which is a six-winged angel. Where it comes from, the term comes from Isaiah 6:2, where in Hebrew, seraphim means flaming ones. And it is description of the angels, not a class of angels. Angels turn into hierarchies and classes through Dionysius the Areopagite, who we're going to talk about next time. We'll explain how that happens. But for Francis, there's this winged creature with 6 wings and a face there, and then out of the wings came, the way they paint it, I should get one of these paintings and bring it. They show kind of beams of light coming out of the wounds of Christ and hitting Francis in the hands. I'll get one of those and bring it to you. Okay? Another thing that pops up here is the figure of divine wisdom. Okay? Chokmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Latin, Sapientia Sophia in Greek, Sapientia in Latin. And this is basically it means wisdom, just like ordinary idea of wisdom. Grammatically, it is feminine in all of these. And notice there is some confusion or at least ambiguity within some mystical traditions about femininity and masculinity of God and so forth. Most of the mystics would probably say that God transcends gender as we understand it. So he can be both male and female because he's really neither male nor female. You know what I'm saying? But Christ is clearly male and Mary is clearly female. So there's ambiguity in that. And what happens is divine wisdom, who is a figure in the Old Testament, is grammatically female and becomes described linguistically as feminine, right? She did this, she did that. Wisdom came into my heart and I loved her. Okay? It's all feminine grammatically. Now, we would say wisdom came into my heart and I loved it, right? We have a neutral, non-gender pronoun that we can use. But they didn't in these medieval languages. It was either grammatically feminine or masculine. So, there becomes all sorts of ambiguity arising around these things. Is the Holy Ghost wisdom? Is Jesus wisdom? Is wisdom, Mary? I mean, all of these things, and how you describe them as feminine, essentially you anthropomorphize, in a sense, wisdom into a female angel or something like that. Okay? So, this is also the case in Judaism to some extent, right?
Yeah.
That is, you see, in one sense, God transcends. How do I get this down? He transcends the gender, and in other senses, he's got gender. Okay? Questions on any of that? Now, the last thing we want to talk about today is the idea of pilgrimage and its relationship to mysticism. Now, notice, some of these things we talk about were more important in medieval times than they are today in terms of their mystical significance. For example, relics, icons, pilgrimage are three pillars of ancient mysticism that are less significant today. And you will see, McGinn doesn't go into those as much. That is, he could have had a chapter on relics and mysticism. He doesn't, because it's kind of viewed as superstitious by modern Catholics as opposed to medieval Catholics. So first we'll look at pilgrimage a little bit today, and then we will look at icons and relics later on as meaningful to the mystic. Yeah.
Do the Eastern faiths tend to keep with relics and icons? Well, they do icons for sure, but more than the Latin.
Well, yeah. As a general rule, the Eastern Christians are more conservative in their theology and beliefs than the Western Christians. And, for example, Latin American Catholics would be much more into relics and icons than would an American Catholic, who thinks it's kind of silly superstition. So there's clear changes in time and changes in place. Like I was down in Mexico a year ago and went around to some of these churches, and there's icons, statues, healing saints, all sorts of offerings they've given to these saints, candles, hanging ribbons, all sorts of stuff's being done. So clearly, it's still significant to many Catholics. But if you look at the average American Catholic, this is kind of just something silly that they used to do in the old days. For the mystics, this was really important. Does that answer your question? Okay, so pilgrimage is a universal phenomenon in all world religions. From the Christian point of view, it originates in both biblical pilgrimage to the temple. All biblical pilgrimage, that is Old Testament pilgrimage, was to the temple. Christ himself is a pilgrim in the New Testament. On a number of occasions it says he goes to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover, feast of dedication, whatever it might be. his trips to Jerusalem tend to be pilgrimage trips to worship at the pilgrimage festivals, not just to go down there and teach. He goes and teaches and reveals himself as the Messiah, but he does it at the festivals. Do you see what I mean? In terms of his Jerusalem ministry. There's also some Hellenistic practices of pilgrimage that get picked up indirectly through the imperial church and so forth. Now, pilgrimage is symbolic and mystical in a number of different ways. I mean, there is a physical pilgrimage where you physically go to a place, but that physical pilgrimage is supposed to be accompanied by a spiritual pilgrimage of the soul who is lost, wandering, and finding the way back to God. So the pilgrimage is the search of the mystic for God. The pilgrim is called a peregrinus, which means a stranger or a foreigner. So notice, it's not, pilgrim to us means a guy who's going on a religious journey, but it's much more that I'm in a foreign land and I'm going back home. That is, the pilgrimage is going home. You're a foreigner. Lots of ascetic things were done on pilgrimages, like fasting and lots of prayer and vigils and stuff like that. Okay? You also see pilgrimage associated fundamentally with tombs. Now, why do I say Christian pilgrimage is associated with tombs? What's the first great Christian pilgrimage site?
Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Exactly. Which is?
Where Christ was crucified.
Tomb of Christ. And then there's the tomb of Mary there. And each pilgrimage site is associated with the tomb of a saint of some sort. Not entirely, but generally. The other thing might be a miraculous theophany of some sort. So, for example, Guadalupe, the Shrine of Guadalupe in Mexico, is a big pilgrimage site for the veneration of Mary. She's not buried there, but she appeared there to an Aztec peasant, according to the tradition, and they have an icon of her there, which is a miraculous icon. So in a sense, they have, because Mary's ascended into heaven, she doesn't have a tomb, but they have this icon which was miraculously produced on the robe of the peasant, and that is then her manifestation there. So it's not 100% tomb veneration, but it's intimately connected with that. And if you don't, what if you have a church and you don't have a tomb of a martyr or a saint in it? Then you get a relic, you get a piece of his bone, you'll get his leg bone or something and take it there and put it there. And so having relics is a key ingredient in pilgrimage. Okay? When you go on pilgrimage, you want to get healed, both spiritually and physically. And you want to do penance. You want to repent. So pilgrimage is a penitential phenomenon. And notice how all of these can get mystical meanings to them, right? That is, the mystic needs to have purgation, that is, repentance, before he can journey to God. The pilgrim has to do penance before he can go on pilgrimage, or while he's going on, or the act of pilgrimage is a penance. Does that make sense? So the journey is the lost soul seeking God. The arrival at the shrine is entering the mystical presence of God. I mean, all of these aspects of the pilgrimage become allegorically the mystic's journey. And the mystic's journey for the mystic is the real pilgrimage. The physical pilgrimage is an aid to that, but the real one is the journey of the soul back to God. Do you see what I'm saying here? So this is a crucial element in medieval mystical contemplation and stuff. I've listed here, we don't have time to go into all of these, but I've listed here a whole bunch of different characteristics of what's going on during pilgrimages, okay? Going barefoot, that's ascetic. Wearing coarse clothing, like not fancy clothes, but rough clothes. Giving away your alms to the poor, fasting, vigils, prayers. You stay up all night praying at a shrine. They still do that at the Holy Sepulchre. If you stay in the Holy Sepulchre past, I think, 10 o'clock in Jerusalem, they'll close the doors and they won't let you out again. You have to stay there and do vigil all night. I mean, you could do that. I almost did it once, but they would have sent out the police to drag me back to the Jerusalem Center. Anyway. So, lots of different things going on these pilgrimages. And they are sites of miracles, visions, and healings. So, in other words, pilgrimages become the sites of thaumaturgy or miracle working, as the holy men of the old desert monks could do. Now, notice, what they're really saying there is that the holy power of a holy person, be it Jesus or Mary or Saint Francis, that person is imbued with, through their mystical experiences, is imbued with holy power while they're still alive. They become living saints, and because they're imbued with that holy power, they can commit miracles, do miracles. Okay. Now, when they die, their holy power doesn't disappear. It's still there. They are now in heaven and can intercede, and they intercede through the material remains of their body, be it their clothing or a staff they owned or their sandals or their bones. And so that holy power of the saint continues to be manifest, generally localized at their shrine after their death. So it's not, it is the saint in his exalted celestial form who intervenes with God and through whom God creates the miracle. Okay, it's not the saint doing the miracle. God is doing the miracle, but he does it through the holy, the conduit of that is through the holy saint. Okay, does that make sense to people? So, pilgrimage is both a allegorical theme of mysticism and a practical thing that mystics would do.